A $1 mixture can bring dead soil back to life overnight. Not in theory, not in a lab, but right there, in your own garden. Dry, cracked earth that couldn't hold water suddenly begins to soften, darken, and breathe again by morning. No expensive fertilizers, no complex system, just a simple brew, made from things most people already have. And when it works, it doesn't just feed the plant. It wakes up something much deeper beneath the surface. Because what's really changing isn't the soil, it's the life inside it. So the real question isn't whether this works, it's this. If something this simple can trigger a microbial explosion in just one night, why has it stayed hidden for so long? To understand that, we need to go back to the moment we stopped treating soil as something alive and started treating it as something to control. There was a time when soil was not something to manage. It was something that managed itself. Beneath every forest floor, the ground stayed soft without tilling, moist without irrigation, fertile without anything being added from the outside. Dark layers of earth held together by invisible threads of life, fine white roots weaving through it, fungi stretching in networks too small to see, yet vast enough to connect entire ecosystems. Nothing was wasted, nothing was forced, and yet everything grew. But over time, that relationship began to change. As agriculture scaled, soil was no longer seen as a living system. It became a medium, something to hold nutrients, something to be controlled, measured, optimized. Fields were cleared, organic matter was reduced, inputs replaced processes. Fertility was no longer something the soil generated. It became something applied from the outside. And slowly, almost unnoticed, the texture changed. The dark, spongy ground became pale and compact. Water stopped soaking in and started running off. Crops no longer thrived on their own. They depended. More inputs, more water, more control. The system worked. It produced more, faster, at scale. But something else was fading beneath the surface. Not nutrients, not minerals. Something far less visible, but far more fundamental. And whatever was lost, it wasn't something you could see by looking at the soil. It was something you could only understand by looking inside it. What was lost wasn't visible, but it was never absent. It was still there, waiting beneath the surface. Because soil was never just dirt. It was alive. Not metaphorically, but literally, biologically alive. Inside a single gram of healthy soil, there can be more living organisms than there are people on this planet. Billions of bacteria, miles of fungal threads, microscopic networks constantly breaking down, rebuilding, exchanging, communicating. This is what makes soil function, not the nutrients themselves, but the life that transforms them. Bacteria break down organic matter into forms roots can absorb. Fungi extend the reach of plants, pulling water and minerals from places roots could never reach alone. And together they produce signals, chemical messengers that tell roots when to grow, when to branch, when to search. This is not a passive system. It is active, responsive, and constantly evolving. But when that system is disrupted, everything slows down. The life fades. The structure collapses. The soil becomes dependent. And yet, the mechanism itself never disappears. It only goes dormant. Because under the right conditions, these microorganisms don't just return, they multiply. Fast. Give them moisture, and they wake up. Give them energy, and they begin to divide. Give them a living environment, and the population doesn't just grow, it explodes. This is what scientists call a microbial bloom, a chain reaction where one cell becomes two become four become thousands, then millions, in a matter of hours. Not over weeks, not over seasons, but almost immediately. And when that happens, the soil doesn't need to be fed anymore. It starts feeding itself. So the question is no longer whether this system exists. It always has. The real question is this: if life in the soil can be reactivated this quickly, can it be triggered on demand? If this system can be awakened, then the next step is surprisingly simple. Not a machine, Not a specialized product, just a container and a few basic ingredients, a jar of water, a spoonful of sugar, and a handful of living soil. That's enough to begin. The water creates the environment. The sugar acts as an immediate energy source, and the soil introduces the local microorganisms already adapted to that exact place. Nothing imported, nothing engineered, only life, taken from where it already exists. Once combined, the mixture is left to sit, not sealed tight, not disturbed, just enough time for something quiet, but powerful, to begin. Within hours, the microorganisms sense the conditions. Moisture returns, energy becomes available, and the response is immediate. They wake up, they feed, they divide. What was once a dormant population becomes active again, and what's forming inside that simple jar is not fertilizer. It's a living solution, a concentrated burst of biological activity, ready to be returned to the soil. No precise measurements required, no technical training needed, because this isn't about controlling the process. It's about creating the right conditions and letting biology do the rest. Anyone can try this, anywhere, with almost nothing, and that's exactly what makes it so unusual. Because if something this simple can restart a biological system that took years to collapse, then it raises a different kind of question, not about how it works, but about what happens next. Does it actually change the soil, or is it just another temporary effect? The difference doesn't appear all at once. It begins quietly. In one test, two identical patches of soil were prepared side by side. Same sunlight, same crops, same watering schedule. The only difference was what was added. One received nothing but water. The other was treated with the living brew. For the first few days, there was no dramatic change. The surface looked the same. The plants showed little difference. But below the surface, something had already started. By day 5, the soil in the treated patch began to loosen. Not tilled, not broken apart, but softened from within. Water no longer sat on top. It soaked in. By day 7, the first visible signs appeared. Leaves in the treated soil carried a deeper green. Stems felt firmer. Growth, subtle at first, became measurable. Root samples taken at this stage told a clearer story. In untreated soil, roots remained short and sparse. In the treated soil, they extended further, branching more aggressively, searching deeper. By day 30, the contrast was no longer subtle. The untreated soil had hardened again after repeated watering. Moisture evaporated quickly. The treated soil held structure. It retained water longer. It stayed darker, alive, and the plants responded accordingly. Growth rates increased, stress signs decreased, yields improved. Not because more nutrients were added, but because the system that delivers nutrients had been restored. What stands out is not just that it works, it's how fast the shift begins. Within days, not seasons. Something that had been dormant for years reactivates almost immediately when the right conditions return. And once that process starts, it begins to sustain itself, which leads to a different kind of question. If a method this simple can restore function so quickly, without external inputs, without repeated application, then why isn't it the standard? And this is where the pattern becomes harder to ignore, because the method itself is not new. It doesn't rely on rare materials. It doesn't require advanced tools. It doesn't even need to be purchased. It can be made anywhere. And once it works, it reduces the need for almost everything else. Less fertilizer, less water, less intervention, which makes it powerful, but also difficult to fit into a system built on repetition and supply. Because most agricultural inputs follow a simple logic. They are produced, packaged, and sold, again and again. Consistency, scalability, standardization. That is what allows them to move across millions of acres. But a living solution doesn't behave that way. It changes depending on the soil. It adapts to the local environment. It cannot be stored indefinitely or replicated exactly the same way twice. And most importantly, It removes dependency. A grower who can regenerate soil biology on their own no longer needs to rely on constant external input. Not every season, not every cycle, and that creates a quiet conflict. Not because the method is hidden, but because it doesn't align with the systems that dominate modern agriculture. So it remains on the edges, passed between small communities, shared quietly, tested in gardens, rather than scaled across industries, not rejected, just not prioritized, which leads to a realization that feels almost uncomfortable. Effectiveness alone is not what determines what becomes widespread. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the easiest to overlook. So in the end, the problem was never as complicated as it seemed. The soil was not failing. It was waiting. Waiting for the conditions it was designed to respond to. Waiting for the signals that had been removed. Because soil does not lose its potential. It only loses activity. And activity can return, not through force, not through more inputs layered on top, but by restoring the one thing everything else depends on: life. When that life comes back, the system begins to shift. Water starts to stay where it falls. Roots begin to explore instead of struggle. Nutrients move, not because they are added, but because they are unlocked. And slowly, almost quietly, the need for constant correction begins to fade. Less input, less intervention, less control. Not because the soil needs less, but because it finally starts doing what it was always built to do. And that changes the question entirely. It is no longer about how much to add or how often to apply. It becomes something simpler. What does the soil need to function on its own again? Because if something as small as a simple brew can restart that process overnight, then the boundary between a dead system and a living one is thinner than it looks. And maybe the real limitation was never the soil, but the way it was understood. So the next time the ground looks dry, compact, unresponsive, the question might not be what to add, but what needs to be brought back. And how many other systems, just as powerful, are still right beneath the surface, waiting to be seen again.